I'm an exchange alumnus.
I'm an exchange alumna.
I'm an exchange alumna.
I'm an exchange alumnus.
I am an exchange alumna.
I'm an exchange alumna.
People, places, and international exchange. Voices of Exchange delivers unforgettable first-person stories from people transformed by international exchange.
I remember learning how to cook.
These exchange alumni share stories of growth, unexpected friendship, and career inspiration from all around the world.
We are
the Voices of Exchange.
I can only speak for being an American. It's the only citizenship I've ever had, or the only place I've ever, lived before I went to my Fulbright. Growing up, even when you're eclectic and original, you're still original within a very narrow context. So I was interested in comics and sci-fi and things of that nature, and that was eclectic for the setting I was in. And it still is. It still is eclectic. But part of kind of my triumph, the triumph of a lot of people, is realizing even if I'm doing well in this box, this is still a box. And there's a lot of other experiences that you can kind of break into. Like, I remember my mother took us to dinner one day. She made us dress up and go to some fancy steakhouse or something like that. I was a little boy. She made us dress up, and like the violin player, came over and started playing violin at our table. And this was an important thing for us to see, right? Because this is the way some people live. And I remember being 7 or 8 years old and thinking I belonged there. Right? Now, we didn't do that ever again. I haven't done that as a grown-up with an actual job. But the point is that there are other places in country when I was young. There are other settings, right, where if you want to do it, you can belong. If that's the art world or what have you. And I think that attitude of being encouraged to explore and try different things, it doesn't mean the things outside of your community are better. It just means that you should be able to have access to whatever you want.
Growing up in LA with a Trekkie mom, learning that barriers were meant to be broken, and connecting the dots on disease through data. This week, Howard University alumnus Dr. Brandon Ogbunu takes us on a journey from his humble beginnings to his Fulbright in Kenya. And yes, why he's not afraid to boldly go where no one has gone before.
My name is Professor Brandon Ogbunu. I'm an assistant professor at Yale University, and I'm a geneticist who studies epidemics. I was the child of the HIV pandemic in the United States. I remember what that was like. I remember what the crack epidemic was like in the United States. These are things I have very vivid memories of, growing up in the 90s mostly. And so, this is a big part of my imagination. But to see the way it looked in another setting, to see how disease manifested in another setting, for all the problems, I never had to deal with a mosquito-borne illness. It's one of the leading causes of death in the world for children under 5. I also saw the way HIV/AIDS worked, or and ravaged communities right in that part of the world. And I think HIV continues to be a major problem, but I think even by the early to mid 2000s, it was a different conversation in the United States, right? This is over a decade post Magic Johnson, right? So the United States has had a lot of a sophisticated conversation. We had pretty effective drugs that were pretty widely available, right? I was able to see kind of how the pandemic was playing out in another setting. So broadly, I was exposed to illness and the way that it kind of ravages communities and the way it shapes economies. And that's the interesting thing about malaria. Not only does it cause a lot of disease, mortality, and morbidity, it actually kind of drains communities because of kind of the number of daily adjusted, life years lost, work, these types of things, that it actually just drains communities up. Families are affected. When I think about kind of the long view of what my story is, I think I think you could think about it multiple different ways. You could kind of painted with the classical descriptions of an African American growing up in a at best lower middle class, but probably not even setting. That's an important detail. but by an enormous amount of privilege I had being raised by the woman that I was raised by. So I think I was raised by an African-American woman from Baltimore. And I think I had a lot of an advantage over a lot of other people in my community because she was, really just an extraordinary person. She kind of had this view of there's nothing in this world that you can't have. Importantly, it wasn't just that she pushed me to be academically successful. I actually was not an especially good student. School was very easy for me, but I actually didn't really try very hard. Her thing was more like expand, push the envelope, be original, be a leader, think differently, right? So, for example, my mother was interested in science fiction in the 60s. You know what I'm saying? She was a Trekkie. and that's something. So I had that at home, right? And so seeing that, she was putting New York Times science articles on the refrigerator from young. And so my point is, it's like I never, ever, ever felt like there was any setting I didn't belong in. I felt like I was never, ever felt lesser than anyone ever. And I saw her kind of stand up to people and defend herself in these really amazing, I would see her get disrespected by people and her just break them down. And you're 7 years old and you see your mother doing that. She's raising you by herself. So I always entered this world that, with the notion that barriers are meant to be broken. Rules, you want to obey the law, but silly rules don't matter. And if somebody tells you something that you can't do, it's just a matter of you hustling and figuring it out. And that's something I've carried. I run my research lab that exact same way to this day. So so again, you can think about it from one perspective, that is these classical kind of markers of disadvantage, which are true, and I think had a very, very large impact on me and my life and my mother's life. And still do in some ways. But I think I had a lot of privileges that other kids did not have by virtue of part of my motivation is, like one of the things I'm about kind of giving access to people. And part of that is just my politics. And I believe in people having an opportunity. But, part of it is there's just no question that my mother would have been a better scientist than I would had she had the opportunities that I had. No question. She taught me algebra. You know what I'm saying? And so she didn't have to raise 3 kids by herself. So my point is, I have to try to do well, right? Just kind of out of honor. That's why when people talk about what people are capable of and incapable of, it doesn't even make any sense to me. Because I see this at home, and I see how society and challenges kind of force people and kind of to be able to do certain things. You think the difference between me and my mother is talent? That's the silliest thing I've ever heard in my life. And so I try to go through life with that way. Life presents challenges to people. There were people more talented than me in my community. They just didn't have my mother. At Howard University, where I went to college, there was a kind of growing interest in students applying to kind of prestigious scholarships and fellowships like the Marshall and the Truman and the Rhodes and the Fulbright. And the idea here is that, we had a good group of students whose interests were growing and diversifying. And so I think there was a campus push. I think maybe a year or two before me was the first Rhodes Scholar in the history of Howard University, right? So I think there was this kind of idea that our students could compete nationally and should be kind of immersing themselves in these types of experiences. I was eager to kind of push myself and kind of do different and eclectic and exciting things. There was kind of a campus buzz around people kind of getting involved in things. And then I think that ran parallel with a growing interest of mine in global health and activism and doing well and inequalities and things of this nature, which also ran parallel to my scientific career. So I had these kind of a lot of things were going on at the same time. Here's the greatest thing about my experience at Howard University in the sciences. Everybody next to you, you wanted them to achieve. That's the single thing. We wanted us all to do well. So we pushed each other and competed, but we really, really wanted everybody to succeed. And we had a pride in everyone doing well. Now, that changes the classroom dynamic because your self-esteem isn't on the line all the time. You're in a place that's nurturing in a way. It's still hard. You still have to do the work, but you're doing it from a place of, it's not antagonism. It's a place where, I actually want people, I want to do better than you, but I want you to do better than them. Right. And I think that was a really important thing for me to see at that point, not coming from a great academic environment. And I think Howard was really, really important for me and kids like me who come from those types of backgrounds. And that's why I think you see it working. Doesn't work for everybody. You look at Vice President Kamala Harris, for example, right? She's a woman, right, who has a very kind of interesting background of her own, right? And I think she's kind of lived in multiple places. She's from a multi-ethnic background of her own. That's another thing you notice about Howard University. Howard University as a whole is a very accepting place with regards to what your background is. There are a lot of individuals of mixed ancestry there, and they come there and they kind of learn to embrace the positive parts of their identity. And this is something else very, very powerful I see manifesting in Vice President Harris. Personally, I had this growing scientific interest in infectious diseases, and it kind of interfaced nicely with my growing political awareness around inequalities. And I think that it was fostered a lot by kind of my experience growing up with the HIV/AIDS pandemic, which is really the thing that kind of changed my imagination and framed how I thought about kind of disease and the relationship between disease and society. So this was a part of my identity from pretty early. And I think it grew, and I learned to get interested in things like malaria during college. So then kind of when you take these two things and you put them together, I said, it would be really, really interesting and important for my career to be able to kind of do some real work, right, in another part of the world where they're actually being affected by these things. Certainly I saw HIV/AIDS in my community, but I wanted some other experiences. And I had done a lot of laboratory research during college, but it was important for me to get this other step to be able to really, really see these things. At that point, I kind of was between careers. I didn't know whether or not I wanted to practice medicine. I didn't know if I wanted to do research. I had a bunch of different ideas. And so I thought that this experience would be a good opportunity to do so. I ended up meeting with some of the administrators on campus involved with the U.S. Fulbright Fellowship, and I decided that it was for me. I then ended up contacting individuals everywhere kind of across the country who had connections to kind of countries around the world, in particular, right, Africa, where there was kind of a major malaria problem. And I ended up forging this relationship with the International Center of Insect Physiology and Ecology based in Nairobi, Kenya, one of the leading kind of NGOs in the world that did kind of malaria vector control and other kind of insect work, actually, which was important. And that kind of led to me applying to work there for a year, and I was accepted. The Fulbright experience kind of changed my career, right? And, closed some doors and opened others. Because again, if you look at my career, even today, I have multiple interests. My lab works on multiple things. I look at the world multiple ways. And that's just a part of my personality. And it's kind of always been that way. So in college, I said, all right, well, I'll apply to everything. I said, I'll apply to medical school. I'll apply to graduate schools and everything from chemistry to biophysics. That's how kind of diverse my interests were coming out of college. And then I applied to everything. I got accepted into everything. And then I also got the Fulbright Fellowship. So I went there with the idea I was going to come back and start medical school at Yale, and then also kind of do a PhD. And I think the year in Kenya working there really was the most important one of the most important years of my life for personal reasons, spiritual reasons, scientific reasons, social and political reasons. It opened my eyes to everything about how the world worked, the way disease works, the way people are kind of thinking about it. And I decided at that point, there was pretty much no way I was going to be bottled up in a job where I couldn't kind of do this type of expansive work all the time. And also kind of having seen and been exposed to the way the world worked, I was eager to recreate the life, to be a more adult version of the life that I had in Kenya in some ways, where I was able to, create and innovate and work with innovative people around solutions. So problem solving on a global scale was the thing that I knew I wanted to do from my Fulbright experience. So my time in Kenya definitely opened my eyes to the way the world worked. The things that Kenya taught me about the world were important for me to learn at that stage in life. You have to remember, I'm from public housing in the United States, right? And so I had this conception of the way poverty worked here, and I still have that conception of the way poverty worked here because it's very, very serious in the United States. And I think what I needed to learn was the way the COVID era, right? Misinformation, has been one of the great shapers of COVID-19 policy around the world. So the war, it's not, we've been fighting the disease, but we've been fighting this poor messaging. And I think with social media, things can go viral in a moment. And I think I constantly do that. So what do? I engage in active conversations with communities. I've engaged in multiple forums. I've talked to heads of church, everything like that. I make myself available. And what do I actually say when I'm having these conversations is the most important point. Number one, you have to come from a place of empathy. You look back in American history, or not even look back, you look at American history now, right? You look at there are a lot of reasons to be distrustful. And there are a lot of reasons to be distrustful, right? I think the experimentation on certain bodies and certain populations is a part of the legacy of science and medicine. It is. And so we have to admit that and deal with that very, very squarely when we're talking about kind of how to get people on board with this. That said, what I try to say, what I'm telling people about why I'm confident in the vaccine is the vaccine development process, the people who are doing the science, it's not some person sitting in a White Castle, right, pushing buttons and making a decision. The people working on the vaccine are people like me. It's people who are hustling and trying to do the right thing, right? We really, really are. Right? There's no kind of magic kind of person on the moon making these decisions. This is a process of tens of thousands of scientists who put their kind of effort and their lives on the line, to try to make this type of thing work. So my point is, by walking people through both the past and the present, the idea here is that we can get people to understand that science, it can work. This thing did not take a year. The research behind the vaccine goes back decades. In fact, like the mRNA technology in particular, vaccinology is several decades, right? In terms of its modern phase. So the technology itself has been around for many, many years. And I think what COVID did was all the virology world stopped. Everybody stopped what they were doing and pivoted their attention towards COVID. And so we were able to do more in a short amount of time and better ever. My group, for example, I had other things to work on. We stopped a year ago, shifted our attention towards COVID, and put out, we published several manuscripts on this. And I think that goes for a lot of people. So when you actually think about, the fact that technology is better now, right? Well, it's the fact that we've been thinking about this for many decades, right? B is that technology is better in 2021 than it's ever been. And then C, everybody, the whole kind of medical world and the biomedical world and the scientific world stops and pays attention. All of a sudden, that amount of time isn't so short, right? When you actually think about it that way, and I think that's how we were able to do this. I call myself a disinformation and misinformation warrior. And it's, which is, a silly label in some ways, but it does acknowledge that the climate calls for people who are willing to kind of engage, that disinformation and misinformation are just as big illnesses as the actual illnesses are. I've been involved in kind of very, very large conversations with people where they can ask questions about kind of the vaccine and why they should or shouldn't, or things that they saw on YouTube. I got a lot of very interesting theories and things on Mars and robots in the bloodstream. But again, to a point that's very critical and important to make, I cannot dismiss those. You have to engage people because at the end of the day, people want to be healthy and happy and have fun with their family and have a good time. So simply calling on your credentials, right, is not an appropriate way to engage people. You have to meet people where they are. You have to empathize with what their fears are and try to gently walk people through. You don't talk down at them. You talk with them. And at the end of the day, I can't tell anybody what to do. Right. What I can do is lay out the information in a manner that kind of empowers them to make their own decision. And I think I've been able to do that. As far as I'm concerned, that's more powerful than anything I will do in a laboratory. And I found that just as gratifying as anything. What my Fulbright experience did for me, it really is the most important intellectual year of my life. So a couple things. Number one, I came out of college, I was chemistry and mathematics, and I had taken a little bit of biology here and there. I had never taken a course on ecology, on evolution, on insects, anything, ever. Not for a second, okay? I went to Fulbright and I read everything about mosquitoes. I published 3 manuscripts about mosquitoes and ecology and doing work in nature. I had never done work in nature before, right? So my point is, I was able to really do science originally on my own with a lot of independence, having forged my own relationships, doing work in infectious disease. So that's what my point is in terms of my independent scientific trajectory. I mean, now I'm a professor of ecology and evolution of infectious disease. I mean, the thread runs directly from my Fulbright experience. I still publish work on malaria. I don't do it mosquitoes, but I still do work on malaria. And we write in a grant on malaria. So the signature on my science is very, very, very clear. I have a very kind of interesting and complicated family history of myself, right? So my father is Nigerian, but I was not raised by him, right? So I don't have a relationship at all with my father. I was raised by my mother, who's African American. So my point is, going to Kenya, where I do not have ancestry. I have no connection to Kenya, kind of, ethnically or genealogically. It was still me connecting with Africa in a way, and I found out kind of making a connection with the continent in this way was very important for my kind of emotional and psychological development as a young person, and I did not realize that until after I was there. To see how beautiful the continent is and how beautiful the people are, how young the continent is, how they will not be denied moving into this next century. They're bright, they're gonna do great things, and they're gonna be the world is going to have to contend with them in a good way, right? In the sense of they're going to kind of they're going to do wonderful things in this world. That was very, very important for me to see. And then more generally, just like the global perspective on things. Look, the thing about being American, independent of what your background is, we are narrow. And even me, I thought I was kind of broad-minded as like a college kid, right? I thought I was, and I thought that I kind of knew what went on in the world, particularly after 9/11, right? I think a lot of us began to think about how the world worked. I realized when I was in Kenya, I didn't know anything about the way the world actually worked. And to have to kind of even talk to not just Kenyan scientists, but Cameroonian scientists and Belgian scientists, and right from around the world, I think, wow, this is how science actually works around the world. There are independent scientists around the world doing cutting edge, world-class work. I felt like more of a citizen of the world because of the Fulbright experience. I can only speak for being an American. It's the only citizenship I've ever had, or the only place I've ever lived before I went to my Fulbright. Growing up, even when you're eclectic and original, you're still original within a very narrow context. So I was interested in comics and sci-fi and things of that nature, and that was eclectic for the setting I was in, and it still is. It still is eclectic. But I think part of kind of my triumph and the triumph of a lot of people is realizing even if I'm doing well in this box, this is still a box. And there's a lot of other experiences that you can kind of break into. Like I remember my mother took us to dinner one day. She made us dress up and go to some fancy steakhouse or something like that. I was a little boy. She made us dress up. And like the violin player, came over and started playing violin at our table. And this was an important thing for us to see, right? Because like, this is the way some people live. And I remember being 7 or 8 years old and thinking I belonged there. Right? Now, we didn't do that ever again. I haven't done that as a grown up with an actual job. But the point is that there are other places in country when I was young. There are other settings, right, where if you want to do it, you can belong, if that's the art world or what have you. And I think that attitude of being encouraged to explore and try different things It doesn't mean the things outside of your community are better. It just means that you should be able to have access to whatever you want, right? And that's what I've tried to do. So going to Howard University, going to the Fulbright, going to Yale for my PhD, going to Harvard for my postdoc, going for my jobs from Vermont to Brown, now back to Yale. At all of these places, two things have been true. One is I've had to expand and get out of my comfort zone in every single one of these settings. All of my research, I've had to learn new things. All of my writing and outreach, I have to learn new things, but I also stick and bring myself to those jobs. I do not feel like I have to be someone else in these settings. Like what you're getting here is pretty much just the grown-up version of me at 17 years old. Right? I just read a lot more books since then. And I think that message of your home and yourself is a valuable thing. You are brilliant and beautiful the way you are, but there's nothing in this world you can't have. I think that's a theme. And I think the Fulbright experience was a very important part of that theme. I encourage people, don't be afraid to get outside of your comfort zone. If you look in any paradigm, the people who made leaps forward did just that. They were people who kind of got into different things and they thought they were crazy, or other people thought they were crazy. So programs like Fulbright, right? And I really urge people to try something truly different, right? Now you should have the skills to do the work. You shouldn't be unprepared to do the stuff, right? But if you have the skills to do it, try something different, in particular as you're a junior person kind of developing your professional identity and who you are, be that photography or anthropology or art, or in my case, science. You will thank yourself in the long term for having kind of made these types of bold steps. And I think the Fulbright is a perfect example of that. The exchange changed my life.
We'd like to thank Dr. Ogbunu for sharing his inspiring story with us. We'd also like to thank you, our listeners, for tuning in each week. And don't forget to subscribe to keep up with our latest episodes. You can find us on all major podcast platforms. And be sure to share your favorite podcast, Voices of Exchange, with everyone you know. For more on these incredible stories, head over to alumni.state.gov/Voices of Exchange. And as I would say when I was in Paris, merci beaucoup et à bientôt, which means thank you very much and see you soon.